There's a question. There's a question that's asked that there was no one more dear, more beloved to Sari Menu than Yitzchak. She was born to him when she was 90 years old. As Alan mentioned yesterday, which we discussed, the Rabbi Bachia, that the gematria of Ayu, which the portion begins, is 37. Vayu Chayu Sora. What was the life of Sora? The numerical value of Vayu, 37 years, although she lived 127 years. But what was the years that she truly lived? Those 37 years. That was the how special Yitzchak was to Sari Imenu. So a son who's so close to his mother, and his mother was a matriarch. She's not just a mother loving a son. We find that Sari Imenu had driven out Hagar and her son because she felt that what Ishmael represented would actually, although the influence was literally, the word isn't, we can't even relate how subliminal it was. But nevertheless, Sari Imenu understanding what Ishmael's presence in the home, how it would diminish Yitzchak and prevent Yitzchak to meet his potential, to be the patriarch of Klal Yisrael. She came to Avram and says, you must drive out the maidservant with her son. Although Avram was pained by this, what did Hashem say to Avram? To listen to Shema B'Kola, listen to her voice. And what's her voice? Her prophetic voice. Meaning Sari Imenu was a greater prophetess than Avram Avinu. And she had certain senses that Avram did not have. So Sari Imenu was not to be described her level of Kedusha, of holiness. So a woman like that passes away, her son's not at the funeral. The answer is he wasn't aware of it. And after the Akedah, he stayed on Har Moriah for 3 years. So the Ramban says, so the way it's explained, why did he stay on top of Har Moriah for 3 years? Says the Gemara tells us, as the Mishnah tells us in Brochos, that the Chasid Rishonim, the original devout, scrupulously devout Hasidim, they would spend an hour preparing for the Amidah, for the Shemon Esrei, which makes sense. You're about to approach, have the audience with the king, with the Shekhinah, entering the audience, it needs an hour's preparation. The Amidah itself, the Shemon Esrei, is an hour. Then an hour after the Amidah, another hour. What's the hour afterwards? The way it's explained, it's an hour of reflection to fully absorb and be a beneficiary of that experience. That takes an hour. Firstly, you realize, as I mentioned yesterday, that Rav Saadia Gaon, every day he would do tshuva, although he didn't sin, because every day he realized the next day where he could have been. So he did tshuva for not being at the level that he was the following day, the previous day, which he felt he only realized afterwards where he could have been. After the Amidah, preparing for an hour before, having the experience of engaging with the Shekhinah, having the audience, that hour afterwards, you realize you're a different person. Every time you finish that Amidah, you're a different person because you're elevated. Being elevated, reflecting on that experience, you have a different capacity to be a beneficiary of that. So 3 times a day, every day, the third time, the reflection and being a beneficiary was another level because the person keeps advancing. So I mentioned that the Yalkut tells us that when there was famine, Yitzchak wanted to leave Eretz Yisrael to go to Egypt, as his father went to Egypt. Hashem says, Shchom b'aretz hazeh, remain in the land. Don't go out of the land. Why? So the Medrash says, because just as an Ola, Tamima, that if you have an unblemished offering, if you take it out of the sanctuary, out of the Azorah, it becomes possibly, you would say, it becomes invalidated because it was taken out of its confines of Kedusha. Hashem says to Yitzchak, if you would leave the confines of Eretz Yisrael, which is Eretz HaKadosha, the Holy Land, which is the equivalent of the sanctuary, you become invalidated. So meaning that Yitzchak, pre-Akedah, post-Akedah, he was a different person. He was a different dimension of person. Pre-Akedah, he was not yet the unblemished offering. After the Akedah, now he's done blemished offering. Being the unblemished offering, he has another capacity to be able to absorb and internalize the experience of the Akedah. To be able to experience that reflection was 3 years. To be able to elevate himself and advance himself to that special level that when he comes back and takes Rivka, he'll be another level of patriarch. Due to that experience, due to his being that old Tamima, that unblemished offering. Something just came to mind. Rav Zechariah Baruch once told a story. The original Kovna Rav, the Rav of Kovna, his name is Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. He was the Kovna Rav. When he passed away, there was a question who's going to be his replacement. The replacement was the Dvar Avram. His name was Rav Avram Kana Shapiro. He was the Kovna Rav. He became the chief rabbi of Kovna. Rav Zechariah Baruch had a special relationship with him. However, the other contender for the position was Reb Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. Meir Simcha of Dvinsk was the leading Torah sage of the generation, known as the Or Sameach. And they felt that the Dvar Avram, who was not within the same classification of Meir Simcha, was more qualified for the position than Meir Simcha. Why? This I heard from Meir Shiva. I don't think it's printed anywhere, the story. Because Meir Simcha was of such greatness, although in Torah the Dvar Avram was not the equivalent of him, not nearly the equivalent of him, but to be able to deal, if you're chief rabbi, you have to deal with the constituency of the community. So for Meir Simcha to be able to deal with many of the issues, he would be coming down from his holy perch to engage with at a mundane level. It wasn't appropriate. It wasn't within his personality to deal with all those issues. The Kovna Rav, he was a different personality. He was different, and he was a lesser dimension of kedusha, of knowledge, of Torah knowledge, but he was more qualified. So they came to the Reb Meir Simcha of Dvinsk to explain to him. He says, a person has a golden goblet. How often do you use a golden goblet? Only at that most very special occasion. A silver goblet, a silver cup, use continuously at the semi-special occasion. What does a silver goblet, a silver cup look like after a while? It gets dented. It gets beaten up. A gold goblet, you don't allow that to happen because of its level of preciousness and its value. You only use it on those select occasions. So they said to Reb Meir Simcha, you're the equivalent of the golden goblet. You're at that special level. For the ordinary person to engage with you, it's just not appropriate. However, the Kovna Rav, although he's not Reb Meir Simcha, but he's still qualified. He's like the silver goblet. Gets beaten up, gets tarnished, has to be repaired, whatever it is, that's for you. So I'm saying Yitzchok, to be that patriarch that he was meant to be, to father Yaakovinu, who was the most special of the patriarchs, when he assumed that level of Kedusha, he wasn't able to leave the land. Because now he's become that old Tmima. He's become that unblemished burnt offering. As a result of that, leaving the confines of Eretz Yisrael, now being who you are, you'll be diminished as you take the Ola, the burnt offering, out of the confines of the sanctuary, it becomes invalidated. As a result of that, Yitzchak now has another capacity. When he reflects on what he experienced, it's a different level of internalization, and he becomes a different dimension of person for that reason. 1 second. The question is, it says Avram came, he eulogized her, and he cried for her. He cried for her. So as you asked, usually a person cries, God forbid, hearing such tragic news. One cries, he'd say, he was so stunned, he wasn't able to cry. It's not reality. Avram wasn't just an ordinary person. There's no question. Sarah was his partner in life. As it says, Avram megayer es ha-noshim, the Sarah megayer es ha-noshim. Avram converted the males, she converted the females to monotheism. As whatever Avram was, Sarah was his equivalent as the matriarch. How do you not cry? Of course he cried. No question he cried. Now, what is a eulogy? What does one say at a eulogy? You go and there's it's cited in the Tziv writes about this, that what is the value? The Gemara in Sanhedrin says, there's a question, what is the value of a hesped, to eulogize a person? Is it to honor the family? That people should see how special the family is because this was the patriarch or the matriarch. So you eulogizing and telling the people, articulating the values of that person. So now the family is honored. Well, no, it's covered on this. It's to honor the person who passed away. How you honor that? Now they know how special that person was. How do you honor that person? So the Netziv explains, because if people are touched and are moved by the value of that person's characteristics and attributes and whatever it may be, if they emulate that person now being touched by that, so when they actually rise and advance themselves due to understanding of who that person was, their actions accrue to the person who passed away. That's honoring the dead. Because the reason why they're advancing and they're becoming better people, more involved in spirituality, becoming greater servants of God, it's only due because they appreciate what this person was. Therefore, their growth in spirituality is due to that person. That's covered ames. So if you talk about nonsense at a funeral, which many do, it's not honoring the dead. I mean, it's almost like, you waste everybody's time. Give everybody a good time at somebody else's funeral. The value of the hesped is to identify the person, the void, the vacuum, which has been created due to the person no longer being here. Therefore, people have to pick up the slack. That's the understanding. So therefore, we know people are special. We know people are special. But until you articulate all aspects of that person, you're not touched by understanding how special that person is. He's special. But when you start going and identifying and elucidating in detail why the person's special, even the person who points it out is affected differently. Avram has a loss. He cries. But when he starts eulogizing her and tells the world who Sari Menu was, he's impacted by this. Being impacted, now it's a different level of crying. It's crying now, understanding exactly the extent of that void and vacuum, which no longer exists because Sarah is no longer here. So the crying now is a different dimension of crying. Okay? That's the way it's explained. Of course he cried. It's like shock, loses his life's partner, no question. But after the eulogy, qualitative, it's a different quality and it's different understanding. The basis for that, it's not just a loss, it's the loss of that person and whatever that person represented. That's the understanding. Now, why is the cup small? So I always mention the Ksav Sofer. The Ksav Sofer writes, as a human being's not a machine. We're an emotional entity and we're impacted by information, experiences, positive, negative. What was the greatest moment of Avram's life? The greatest moment of Avram's life was the Akedah. Why was the Akedah such a momentous and special moment? Because now the survival of the Jewish people is guaranteed. Because the arch prosecutor, Satan, regardless of to the degree that he wants to prosecute, we have something to quelch that prosecution, to silence it. What is that? That's the merit of the Akedah. And therefore, Rosh Hashanah, which is the day of judgment, when we blow that ram's horn, the moment that horn is blown, it silences the prosecution of Satan. Why? Because the source, the merit of the Akedah is so overwhelming that Hashem says, I will silence that prosecution because of what you have done. And Avram knew this. So when Avram, and that's why Satan tried to deter him and prevent him from going to the Akedah, not to be able to do it. But when he succeeded, this was the ultimate, because now the objective of creation is guaranteed, because there's going to be a Jewish people, without a question. And despite our failing, we always have that mechanism which guarantees our survival, which is called the schus of the Akedah. So Avram was ecstatic, not to be described what exactly was achieved at the Akedah. So in terms of himself, he was charged at a level of joy and ecstasy, we can't even relate to it. He comes back, he hears that his wife dies. Humanly, emotionally, although as painful as it may be, but a human being has an emotional capacity. Emotionally, being charged at that level, it didn't allow him to fully internalize emotionally the loss of his wife. Of course he knew it. Of course he cried. But the degree that he would have cried otherwise, it was lesser than that, because he's still at that high of the Akedah, and therefore it was impossible for him to come down to that level to fully internalize that grief. Now the question is, but why does there have to tell us that? What does there have to tell us? It's understood. Now that we know we did it, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that it tells us who Avraham Avinu was. That he wasn't able to, I'll give you an example. You bring a person to Rav Shach, and the person, and it was a special experience. Rav Shach, he lived till the age of 107. He was the leading Torah sage of his generation, and he was a very impressive person. Although you were not the Talmud Chacham to be able to appreciate his greatness in Torah, but immediately saw he was somebody very special. You finish, I bring the person there, and 5 minutes later, he says, where's the closest falafel place? Something, you just met Rav Shach. Maybe take a break, reflect on what you had. You're going to go have falafel and listen to some kind of, the latest tunes on the radio. What's going on over here? The person didn't fully appreciate what the experience was, because the moment you walk away from that, you don't go right away to the falafel stand to buy falafel. You understand? Avraham Avinu, coming from the Akedah, he was at a level, the Torah is telling us, even though his wife's, his partner in life, who was the most special person at this moment, he hears she dies, he cannot come down to that level. It tells us who Avram was, what his internalization of the value of the Akedah, that the future of the Jewish people is guaranteed forever, that as much as we fail, the prosecution of Satan can be silenced. So the small cup tells us Avraham Avinu's capacity and appreciation of spirituality, that even such a drastic tragedy as his wife wasn't enough that he fully could internalize that level of loss.